Good start. Hi everyone, welcome to SmugMug Live. This is episode 41, wherever you are today. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Thank you for joining us. Really excited to have you here. SmugMug Live, as always, is brought to you by SmugMug and Flickr. If you are looking for somewhere to showcase your work and share your work, or store your images in the cloud, or indeed have a solution to sell images to your clients and customers, then check out everything we have to offer at smugmug.com. If you're looking to connect with photographers, be inspired, be motivated, be part of groups, or make your own group, then check out everything we have to offer at flickr.com. But for today, SmugMug Live is, as I say, episode 41. Thank you so much. I can see some of you in that chat panel already giving yourselves a shout out from wherever you are. I love to see that. If you haven't done so already, get in the chat window, let me know where you're joining from, and we'll go through them in a few seconds. I'm Alistair Jolly, your host for this show. As always, SmugMug Live, we try and stream a couple of times a week. Today we're going to be joined in a few moments by the incredible Colby Brown. And then we have another show this week tomorrow when I'm going to be joined all the way from Sydney by Easton Chang, who is an incredible automotive lifestyle photographer. So join me back here tomorrow at 12 noon Pacific time. But I'll be joined by Easton. So let's see who's in the chat window today. So we've got lots of people giving themselves shout outs. James is joining us from Phoenix, Arizona. Thanks, James. Thanks for joining us. Rick is in Lawton, Oklahoma. Kaylee is in Mesa, Arizona. Thanks, everyone. A frequent visitor to the show, John Brown, is joining us from my favourite place in the world, Dog Pound, Alberta. Say that every show, but I love that place. Gail is joining us from North Surrey in BC, British Columbia, I'm assuming that is. New York, Idaho. Hello, I'm Ben from Idaho. Lots and lots of people join us from all over the world. Very American based today, so I'll have to put my subtitles up for my accent. But yeah, thank you for joining us. It's always great to see you. Keep those shout outs coming. If at any point today you have a question for our guest Colby Brown, please post those in the chat window. Do me a big favour. Start your question with the word question. That way I can find it in amongst all the chat that's going on in the comments. But if you have a question for Colby, start it with the word question. Ask your questions at any point today. I will interrupt Colby if it's appropriate, or we'll do a little Q&A at the end. But for now, let's see if our guest is with us. Colby, hi, how are you doing?
Doing pretty good, Alistair. How are you doing?
I am doing good. I said, let's see if our guest is joining us. Like I didn't already know you were there. You know, like
we didn't go through this test and this setup. No, not at all.
Yeah, I haven't been talking to you for the last 20 minutes, obviously. So these shows are always very informal. Anybody who's joined us on SmugMug Live before will know that these are quite informal. But we will have a little bit of presentation from Colby shortly. But if anybody's been living under a rock, Colby, and doesn't know who you are, how would you describe what you do? Photographically, sure. Obviously.
Yeah, so, well, I mean, I guess my 30-second elevator pitch is essentially that I am a landscape, travel, and wildlife photographer based out of the East Coast of the U.S. I've been doing this professionally for 13 years. I've worked for National Geographic and lots of other organizations and entities within the photo industry as my career has morphed and changed and evolved over the years. And these days, you know, I typically in a normal year spend, you know, a good 5-6 months out of the year traveling to all 7 different continents, working on all assortments of projects, expeditions, photography workshops. That usually keeps me busy. This year, a little bit different, though.
Yeah, this year is a little bit different. We'll maybe get into that in a moment. But we are delighted at SmugMug that you have been a customer of ours. Did you know it's almost a decade?
It has been quite a long time, for sure.
When we both had long hair when we started.
When I had my curly hair, exactly. Yeah. That's how long you know it's been.
So yeah, we've been delighted to obviously use SmugMug to showcase your portfolios and, you know, share work and that type of stuff. Your portfolio is phenomenal. You just mentioned that you travel to all the continents, and your portfolio just showcases the best places in the world, right?
I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I chose SmugMug back in the day to initially to showcase myself because I hadn't built a website at the time. I didn't know what I was, necessarily what I was doing. And then even as I started building out and customizing my own spaces on the internet, I still kept coming back to SmugMug and using you guys in order to showcase the different variety of images that I've shot over the years. And, I alluded to it earlier and you just kind of mentioned it. Unlike a lot of photographers that have been in my fortunate position to have been doing this for, almost a decade and a half, I shoot a wide variety of things. I'm not just like the landscape guy that just shoots Yosemite National Park or that just does, wildlife in Yellowstone or something like that. I do shoot a big diverse set of things. And because of that, I have quite a wide dispersed portfolio that I want to showcase in the best possible light and be able to sell prints and license images and do all sorts of fun different stuff. And you guys have been a big part of that over the years, and I appreciate that.
Well, the honor is ours to have you on our platform. I mean, I get lost in your portfolio quite a lot of times, especially when we keep saying on a normal year, when you're traveling. I'll see you post something on some of your social channels, and I'll go check out what you're photographing and where you are in the world, and then I go down a bit of a rabbit hole through your portfolio each time, because you have that bucket list portfolio. People will look at your bucket list and say, "Oh, I want to go there. I want to go there. I want to go there." It really is an incredible portfolio.
If you actually think about it from my perspective, when I go through and to plan out a normal year of traveling and what projects do I want to work on, where do I want to teach photography? What expeditions do I want to put together to explore new places? I'm often literally doing that myself, where I'm like, okay, I have X number of months available, or I have a slot available between a trip to Antarctica and, going to Norway to photograph the Northern Lights. So I look at my growing list, which I have on my phone, which essentially is I just I copy and paste every time I come across a new experience or read about something, get inspired by someone else out there doing stuff, whether it's a professional or someone getting into the industry that had this amazing experience. And I take a note. And then when I go to fill out my given normal year, I'm like, oh, I got an opportunity here. February is a good month for this. And let me see if I can slot it in. So I actually get to a lot of my portfolio has originally stemmed from my own personal bucket list of wanting to have these experiences, wanting to document, specific species or see specific cultural events, or travel to very remote parts of the world that I got inspired by someone else or something else that inspired me. And so I'm very fortunate that I get to, check off those bucket list items myself to create this portfolio and put together. I'm very fortunate in that regard.
Well, I guess there's so many opportunities and so many places you want to go to. The best way to do it is choose the places you want to go personally first, and then create great experiences while you're there.
Absolutely. And it starts, it's different for everyone, but for most of us, when we're first starting in photography or even just with a desire to travel, our bucket list tends to be very broad. It's like, I want to go to China, or I want to go to Iceland. And then once you've started doing this for a while, or once you've started checking off some of those of your own bucket lists, it becomes much more specific. And so for me, my list is probably exponentially longer than most people's bucket list because it's not broad anymore. It's like incredibly specific. It's like this specific species in this specific location, this specific time. And so that provides a lot of opportunities, but also it keeps things different and changing and diverse. And I think that's something that I personally need from a personality standpoint, as well as from a creative standpoint. I need that contrast of inspiration, and I need to constantly be challenging myself, which is why I shoot such a wide variety of things outside of a studio. That's why, landscape, travel, wildlife covers a lot of ground, and it allows me to pick and choose where I want to go, when I want to go, and how I want to do those things based on wherever I feel personal absence from those types of things. So if I'm feeling disconnected from nature, maybe I will make sure to include a few more wildlife projects. If I'm feeling overwhelmed with human interaction and contact, like many of us are, and the crazy news cycles we find ourselves in these days, I might want to go to a remote location and just kind of get away and take a break. And so I need that diversity to kind of keep me sane. As a human being, but also as a creative and someone that's done this for a living for a decade and a half to keep it interesting and keep it fun and keep it passionate.
Yeah, I mean, we all want to enjoy what we do. You know, if you enjoy what you do, you'll never work a day in your life, right? So
Absolutely.
It's pretty cool. I'm going to give a few more shout outs because the feed has been going, and I've been trying not to laugh while we're talking. You'll understand why in a moment. But we've got NC has joined us all the way from sunny South Africa. Welcome, NC. Masij is joining us from Luxembourg, so we're getting a lot more international now that things have fired up. Chile is currently dodging hurricanes in New Orleans. Stay safe out there, Chile. I'm thinking about you. Steve Palmer says, Colby, you look so chill. Which is pretty cool. Sheila says, aloha from the Big Island in Hawaii.
Hey, Sheila.
James, a warm hello from Canyon Lake. But this next comment, this is the one I was chuckling at. A dear friend of both of ours, the one and only Michael Bonacore, says, my favorite bald men.
He's just jealous that he's not bald. That's all. He has this beautiful flock of hair that
best hair in the industry, I tell you, Michael.
Best hair. That pains me to say.
Yeah, you don't know what you're missing. Go bald, Michael. Do us all a favor. So we're looking good, fellas. We miss you, Michael. Hope you're well and safe. Wherever you are. I'm guessing you may be in Boise, but hopefully catch up with you soon, dude. But thanks for the comment, even if it is about our lack of follicles. But anyway, lots of awesome comments. And Ramez says, hello from Amman in Jordan.
Ramaz, I love Jordan. Jordan's one of my favorite countries in the Middle East.
We had... just so many great images in your portfolio from that part of the world, and it's fantastic. So we've spoke about the type of work that you do, and both of us have mentioned that dreaded phrase that we all use just now, in a normal year. So, you know, you travel the world, you do these incredible personal photo shoots, you do workshops, you do these tours, which you always have amazing weather for. I don't know how you make that happen. Do you pay extra for the amazing weather? Is that how
I send tweets out to God, and you know, there's some extra added love for the, you know, Mother Nature and whatnot that sprinkles some goodness for at least most of my workshops. Not all the time, but as much as I can.
Yeah, but this year's been very different, and I'm assuming that it's had a huge impact on you personally and your business, right?
Yeah, it's you know, as I think for all of us, it has been a strange year. You know, I started off the year normal. For me, I was in Uganda for New Year's, spending, you know, New Year's Eve with silverback gorillas in the Bwindi impenetrable forest.
As you do.
As you do. And then from there, I went to Norway and took a group of photographers out there to teach them how to photograph the Northern Lights, and that was amazing. And then I went to Cuba, and I was in Cuba teaching street photography, side projects. And it was actually when I was in Cuba that the world grinded to a halt. And it was quite interesting being in a place like Cuba with very limited internet and questionable infrastructure, and, you know, being outside the country when borders started closing, and things really started hitting the fan. And I had to scramble to get my students out as well as myself and back to our homes and safely at the very last second. And this was like, you know, early second week of March. And since then, it's been a whirlwind. I had to cancel multiple expeditions down to Patagonia, to South Africa, to Iceland, Brazil. Pretty much everything for this year has been scrapped. And for me personally, what I essentially did, especially from March to about August, is that outside of a few speaking engagements here and there, I kind of took the year off. You know, I'd spent so much time building up my companies and traveling for 6 months out of the year that it was nice to be home for a prolonged set of time. And it was interesting from my perspective and for my wife's as well. My son-in-law, of course, loved it because dad's home all the time. But for me and my wife, literally since the day we got married, this is the longest set of time that I've ever actually been home consecutively in 10 years. And so it's been wonderful. I thought I was going to have issues with cabin fever. I thought I was going to, freak out a bit with, as travel stopped happening. But I've really enjoyed it. And to be fair, I also I think needed a little bit of that break. It's been challenging, business wise, and I've had to change revenue streams, and we can talk a bit about that. But outside of that, the actual personal time at home has been awesome, and has been something. It's so different for me, and it's I get to play Legos with my son whenever I want to, and walk the dog every day. And we're just now finally getting into fall weather here in eastern Pennsylvania, so it's getting cool. The leaves are just starting to change. So yeah, I think in a situation like this, you really have to find silver linings. And for me, that was the biggest silver lining of 2020 was world's kind of going crazy. We have, crazy politics in each of our countries, all this stuff that's happening, and we have to find things that are positive. And for me, that was a very big positive this year that I think saved my sanity of all the crazy drastic changes was I got to spend time at home with my family for like 6 months, and I really shouldn't be complaining about that. Yeah. So for me, I was fortunate in that.
Yeah, we both spoke about, offline how, fortunate and blessed we are that, we've been able to ride this crazy time. The industry is hurting, and my heart goes out to all those photographers out there that are really struggling because their entire revenues have gone. The silver lining for both you and I, both of whom, we travel constantly, both you and I, and we occasionally cross paths at a trade show here or there, but we're typically on the road somewhere in the world, and it's great to be at home for that extended period of time with the kids, with the wife, and do that stuff. My wife is now asking, like, when do you think you'll be traveling again?
We're getting to the tail end for sure. I think my wife's excited about fall this year for me to be outside the house and taking pictures. But you're right. I mean, the industry is hurting a lot. Manufacturers are hurting a lot. All around. I mean, everyone's getting affected by this in some form or fashion, and it's challenging and it's hard, and businesses sadly will close, and people will have issues. Photographers will have to pick up side jobs to get through this. But again, trying to come back to the positive and the silver lining. If we look back proactively or retroactively at like 2008, 2009, which is the last big, global financial crisis that we all went through, it was challenging for a lot of us. Unfortunately, obviously people lost homes. There was a lot of pain out of that. But at the same time, there was so much ingenious creativity that spurred, people starting new companies and finding new niches and trying to find opportunities in the chaos or the challenging aspect of the economy of whatever country you're in to try to find these opportunities. And so I look back partially, at least fondly, at 2008, 2009 and say, see friends that are now doing well or have been doing well up to 2020 that all are in their position where they are now because they started out of necessity, out of a challenging situation. And so that's what I'm optimistic about this as well with this global, pandemic and COVID, is that it does present challenges and it does bring pain and does bring a lot of issues that have to be dealt with. But out of that, I am still seeing, interesting, creatives apply interesting techniques to creating new revenue streams, to try to do different stuff, to round out corners that they had neglected for years because they were relying on X or Y for certain types of income. Yeah. So I hope we see more of that, to be honest.
I've seen, we've had lots of guests here on the show talking about the things that they've been able to do with, I hate to use the word luxury because, a lot of people in such a bad position, but the luxury of time that the COVID has given us to say, hey, you can't do what you're meant to be scheduled to do. So now might be a good time to focus on those things that you've never been able to find the time to do. We've had Tina Eisen on the show who's started painting and creating artwork, which she's now selling. We've had Bella and Pratik on the show who have been making, incredible software products for, photographers while they've, not been able to do the typical things. So the luxury time has been very beneficial for those to round those corners, that, as you mentioned, and specifically, you've used the time very effectively to kit out an incredible studio that you're sitting in right now.
Yeah, I mean, everything you guys see here has been built for scratch. I mean, I wish I had like a pre-photo. I'm sure I could find one on my phone or something, but this was covered in, kind of, derpy carpet and things weren't nice and all together. And I've completely gutted this room. We put wood floors down. I put audio panels everywhere. We have new lighting setups. Like I've essentially taken this time for my own personal businesses to round out the corners of creating more online digital educational resources, whether it's, tutorials or online boot camps, all sorts of things like that. And this gives me the space to be able to spend more time, creating video content for YouTube or doing all sorts of different things like that. So as we talked about before, I got to round out my corners with the idea or the desire so that when we can start traveling safely again, all of this is set up and I can continue to create and do things on the side while I'm also back doing my expeditions and photographing wildlife around the world and doing workshops and things like that. And so that's my own personal plan and goal has been build this out, focus on online digital, educational content and opportunities, working with companies like SmugMug and Dell and Sony and all sorts of other stuff. But then, also preparing for, hopefully a 2021 that allows both you and I to get back on the road at least a little bit here and there and get back out having some of those fun travel experiences.
Yeah. So all this content that you're making in your new awesome bat cave, when will we be seeing the fruits of that labor? When were you going to start releasing some of that content and courses and that type of stuff?
There, a lot of it's coming in the next, month, 2 to 3. I have, it's one of those funny things that, a pandemic like this happens, or I guess an event happens. And then a lot of people in an industry such as ours in photography all think the same thing. Okay, I need to do everything online. I need to change. If they're educators that do workshops, they're all going to start, releasing online stuff. So I don't want to do what everyone else is doing, at least to the same level. And so I'm trying to think proactively about what holes are yet to be filled. How can I offer the similar type of experience that you get from going to an in-person workshop where you're getting feedback, you're talking, you're communicating, that can come across in an online educational experience. And so I'm creating those as we speak. And so it takes a bit more time, but I think the rewards for people that are interested in learning the types of photography that I shoot will be that much greater. So it will be a mixture of infield video workshops mixed in with post-processing stuff and stuff that I shoot here in the studio, and kind of all together to offer a unique experience that I honestly don't see out there right now. That's my goal, at least. And then out of that, there will also be smaller piecemeal, lower priced opportunities for people to, pick and choose, a la carte options to be like, I just want to learn this, or I'm just interested in this particular editing program, where I'll have those opportunities as well. But I'm always trying to think big picture. I'm trying to think 5 steps ahead, which is interesting in a pandemic when, the 5 steps ahead are it's very confusing, and there's
keep moving.
They keep moving, man, and changing, and sometimes it's not even a goalpost, and so yeah, it's an interesting space to be in, but it's fun, and it's we talked about before. I took 6 months off, which was great, and I've just now got recently have rekindled that passion, that itch, and that desire to really jump back full force now that I have these things all set up. And so now I'm excited for this new challenge. And I think that's part of what I love about photography. And again, shooting a wide variety of stuff is I need that challenge to constantly cause me to want to do more, to invest more of myself, to try new things, to create new things that other people aren't doing, and to do so with a smile on my face. And I have the smile back. I'm excited. I'm refreshed, and we're hitting the ground running, and we got a lot of good stuff coming.
That's cool. You, before we go into your presentation, you mentioned that you're in Eastern Pennsylvania, which is one of my favorite parts of the world. Back in the 90s, I'm dating myself here, but back in the 90s, I used to spend my summers in the Pocono Mountains in Pennsylvania, and it is one of the most under-recognized beautiful parts of America, I think. The Pocono Mountains are phenomenal. The lakes, the forests, the fact that you have seasons is just incredible. I love that part of the world. You're very fortunate to be there.
It's beautiful out here. I mean, we've been out here for 4 years now. Before this, I was living in Boulder, Colorado for 10 years. I spent time growing up in Berkeley, California, as well as Tahoe, Vancouver, BC, Texas. I've been kind of all around. I have extended family out here in this region, and by the time we were done with Colorado or wanting a change, we just decided, me and my wife, that we wanted to, retry the East Coast. She's from the East Coast. I wanted to give it a shot, and we just happened to find a beautiful place out here with tons of acres. And we're right in the heart of the Poconos, as you said. It's we got streams and private lakes and public lakes, and mountains, although there's like an asterisk next to it, coming from Colorado and California and places that I usually travel to in the Himalayas and stuff. Like, these aren't the same mountains, but they still are mountain-like. Yeah. And it's beautiful, and we're very fortunate to be where we're at. I think I read somewhere, although these lists are always so funny, but I read somewhere just like last week that Tannersville, which is like 10 minutes from my house, is rated the #2 spot in the United States to witness fall colors for this year. So we'll see if that brings in a crazy amount of Instagrammers and all sorts of other people that tend to follow those lists and go to these places. But for anyone thinking about checking it out, there are beautiful spots out here that you can be safely out and social distance and away from people, and you get to have some amazing experiences in serenity in nature.
Yeah, it's funny, as a young teenager growing up in Scotland prior to moving to the US when I was in my late teens, Pennsylvania was never on the list. It's not somewhere that in this part, in Europe, you hear much about. It's California, it's Dallas, Texas, it's New York, and when I had the opportunity to move to the Poconos, just outside Scranton, a little place called Hawley, I could not believe just how beautiful it was, and instantly fell in love with it. It really is a beautiful part of the world, and I haven't been back there for a long time, so hopefully I get an opportunity to get back out that way soon. I think people are probably itching by now. We've been talking for 30 minutes to see some of your imagery.
Sure.
When we get into these conversations, it's hard to forget that people are watching them and want to see some of your imagery. So you've prepared a little bit of presentation today. You are known, and I having been around you and seen some of your other presentations, you're a big believer in the power of storytelling through photography, and we kind of titled this "The Art of Visual Storytelling." So I am going to hand over to you for however long you want to do it for. I'm not going anywhere today, so I'm going to hand over to you, and you can share your screen and we can talk through it. Those of you who are in the chat, I don't see any questions in there yet. You must all just be loving the conversation. So get your questions in for Colby during this presentation. If there's something you want to know about, just start it with the word question for me. I'll find it in amongst all this chat that's going on here. And I'll post that question to Colby, whether it's at an appropriate point in the presentation or if it's something a bit more general. We might leave it till the end, but Colby says he's cool to be interrupted, right?
I do like to be interrupted. I like the questions going back and forth for sure.
Cool.
Let me switch there. There we go.
That's it.
All right, so we're good?
Yeah, I'm just gonna change your screen slightly because your picture-in-picture is blocking the presentation.
Oh yeah,
but
it's only on the first page though.
So over to you, sir.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So thank you guys for joining in. Today we are talking about the idea of storytelling. This is something that I have given presentations before on, and it's something that I'm incredibly passionate about. And the reason that I'm passionate about it is because I feel that photography is unique in the sense that it gives us the opportunity to not only share someone else's story or an event or an experience, but also emotion. And I think that as a travel photographer, as a landscape photographer, as a wedding photographer, just as a creative myself, I'm constantly trying to create works of art that invoke a response, that invoke an emotion. And I think that's really important these days, not only to get your story across, but also just to have it seen and to have it appreciated for what it is. And so I want to talk a little bit about what it is, why it's important, give you guys some tips and tricks about what I'm talking about in terms of storytelling, which is going to be both about the nature of a photograph telling a actual tangible story, but also how story-like elements can play a role in your own photograph to help you elevate and create more impactful images. So let's start off this conversation talking about what is the difference between a snapshot and a photograph. Now, when I normally give this presentation and it's in front of a live audience, this is where I take live questions, but because we have a little bit of a delay here on YouTube, we're not going to do that. So I'll kind of just jump right into it. Now, for any of you guys that have ever been to Japan or seen a National Geographic adventure video talking about the famous snow monkeys in Japan, just outside of Nagano. It is a snow monkey park that is a place where these specific kinds of monkeys have been known to find habitat near a natural hot springs. And so if you actually go to the location, this is kind of what you experience, or can experience, at least during the busy times of the day or on a weekend, because it's not that far from Tokyo. And it's also on the tourist track a little bit. And so an image like this is, to me, a snapshot. It is a moment that's frozen in time. And there's nothing wrong with snapshots. Snapshots have a variety of different valuations to individuals, including myself. I use my cell phone to snap shots of experiences like this to remember what it was like, but also to capture moments that, as my son has grown up now that he's 9 years old. But when I take a photograph, it is for a different purpose. And the difference between a snapshot and a photograph is that intent, the intent behind it, the idea that you want to invoke that idea of emotion, that you want to bring someone into your world. You're not just freezing a moment in time. You were trying to let your image act almost like a portal, as if the person is also, the viewer is also there with you. And that's really important when it comes to, like I said, evoking that idea of emotion. Because if we think about it, even if we're talking about from more of a superficial standpoint, as wanting people to look at your images, not necessarily just appreciate or for you to have a more important story to tell. If you are your average user and you're flipping through your Instagram feed and you're seeing all sorts of stuff, generally it is going to be those images that catch your eye, that pull you in, that cause you to stop, that cause people to like and comment and do different things. And the same thing happens with companies in terms of capturing their attention. Those are also the images that typically get licensed. There's all sorts of tangible benefits that stem from this idea of invoking emotion. And the emotion doesn't always have to be positive, and we'll talk about that when it comes to people reacting to your images. And so that's kind of one of the core aspects that I feel is a thread that is woven through the vast majority of my photography, if not all of my portfolio, is this idea that the photograph should not only speak for itself, but have something to say. And so that's a photograph, whereas a snapshot, as I mentioned, is a moment frozen in time. So photographers are visual storytellers. This is something you've probably heard many photographers, say and pontificate on, but there is definitely validity to that. You are a storyteller, and you have the ability to tell stories through your images. Sometimes it's through a still image, which we'll talk about. Sometimes it's through like a photo essay, which is something that you see in National Geographic, a company I used to work for back in the day. And either way, it's important to understand that you do have that power. Again, you can take snapshots with your nice professional camera gear, but creating something with more impact, that's the story behind the image and what you want to hopefully share with the viewer. So I use this example of the different mediums in which we tell stories. So if anyone's read the book The Martian by Andy Weir, a phenomenal book. If you're a science geek like me, it is amazing. It is also like a 350-page book or 400-page book. I can't remember exactly how many pages it is, but it is a lot of pages that the author used in order to tell a story, to captivate an audience, to bring them in. Now, if you saw the movie with Matt Damon, which was also pretty good, I think the book was better, but the movie was great, and Matt Damon played a great role. It was 117 minutes. So the director and the producers had 117 minutes to capture your attention, to bring you into their story, and to get you engaged or involved with what was happening to the main character. As a photographer, you sometimes only have that one moment. You have the ability to capture that one scene, and sometimes it's not a series of images, but that one image that can kind of pull all those pieces together. Now, we have to work in a two-dimensional medium as photography, but there are ways that you can use things that we will talk about, from composition to controlling of atmosphere, all sorts of things to create depth and to create more of a 3D-like feel. And if you think more proactively about the subject matter, how you take them, how you capture those images, the gear you use, all these things, and have them come together, you can create or capture people's imagination and tell a story within that single image. So a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is something that, again, is a saying that's been out there for a long time. And I think that is true. maybe picture isn't the right word. I would say a photograph, at least in terms of the analogy that we're using in this presentation, is the same thing. A good photograph can be worth 1,000 words. I think a lot of us have to change our mindset with how we approach photography. Instead of just taking pictures of pretty things, it has to be about, or in my mind, it should be more about, capturing that interesting story. And we can jump into what I mean by that. So what is your typical story arc? Like, if you think about a book that you're reading, if you think about a movie that you've watched, an experience that you've had, there are generally commonalities throughout the thread of that experience. So if you think about it from a standard position, and Alistair, there we go. We have this typical set of a standard story arc. We have our exposition, which is kind of our starting place, our a sense of location. We have some sense of rising action. This is, things are building up to this plot line shift or change in the movie that we're watching. We have a climax, which is, generally where, the hero, the protagonist of our story has some sort of experience or euphoric idea that transforms them. Then you get some sort of falling action where things slow down a little bit, and then resolution, everything kind of wraps up. Now, with your typical story arc, again, this is what is most common that you see in fictional books and sci-fi movies and all sorts of stuff. But when it comes to photography, the interesting thing is that we are only really responsible for the first 3 sections. So if you think about it, we have the ability to focus on our exposition, so a sense of place, what we include in our images in terms of composition. We are setting the place, the location. We have some sense of rising action where we can control things through things like how we capture motion, where we place our subject, all sorts of different things, controlling depth. We have some sense of climax where we're kind of leading to things. This is where we use compositional elements or story-like elements in terms of how we capture a subject that are leading towards something. And then the falling action and the resolution is actually up to the viewer. So what our job is to do the best that we can as an artist, as a photographer, to control the first 3 elements of this in terms of how we shoot in the field, the gear we use, how we compose, our use of lighting, all the way to how we process that image and then share that result with someone else. And then that viewer fills in those other 2 pieces with their own experiences. So, for example, if I take a beautiful photo of a jaguar in Brazil and I share it with someone else, maybe that person has had an experience with another big cat, and so it allows them to fill in the rest of that story for them personally. And so that's what I love about storytelling from a photography perspective, is that I'm trying to tell the story of my subjects, and I'm trying to lead the viewer in a certain direction based on the choices that I'm making in the field and when I'm processing my images. And then the viewer is the second half of that. They are the people that fill in the rest of the void. And when you have those synergistic meeting points where those 2 things come together, to me, that's where you have an image that is impactful. That's where you have an opportunity to have a more engaging dialogue based on what you're seeing and what I've tried to capture and share with you as an individual.
Yeah, I was just interrupting to ask a question that popped into my head. You mentioned
Sure.
that the last 2 actions, the falling action and the resolution, is up to the viewer. Do you think the way that you craft an image can still help someone have a falling action and resolution that you want them to have by the way you craft the image?
I think you have the ability to lead the viewer in a particular opportunity to have a similar thing. Again, it's hard because as human beings, we all have different experiences. So my particular emotional reaction to an image is probably going to be different from yours, right? So but that being said, I can include specific elements or choose to photograph at specific times of day or specific subjects or all these different pieces that come together that will lead you to a direction that is hopefully closer to my visualization or my realization of where I would like you to go. But because I can't control you, that's the unknown variable. Yeah. And I think that's also the exciting thing. It's not a fear-based thing. It's exciting to sit there and say, okay, how do you relate to what I've done? How good of a job have I done telling a story that you can finish off that story? Or are you getting something completely different that I didn't see, which is certainly possible as well. But either way, it is still my responsibility as the artist, as the creator, to put as much emphasis as I can on those first three elements, so that hopefully we are in the same ballpark when it comes to you feeling, you reacting to it however you decide to react.
Yeah, you can make decisions that help lead them in a direction, but ultimately their interpretation will always be theirs. Yeah,
it's always their interpretation. Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually a really interesting small segue. I don't want to I have a tendency to go too far off on this stuff. But I mean, if you think about this is actually a really good quick segue into talking about how people interpret images. If I think one of the negative or toxic elements that have come out of social media when it comes to photography is that people put so much emphasis on how other people react to their images. I think that there is important to delineate the differences between me creating something and sharing it out there with the hope that we have a commonality in terms of your reaction and the direction that you're going, and you having a adverse or negative reaction and then not liking something, or or me interpreting that as you not appreciating the work that I'm doing. I think that we do need to make sure that there is a difference between the two, for especially a lot of people that are starting out in photography, that you don't need external validation for the stories you're trying to tell, but you can take some of the potential positive criticism, depending on where it's coming from, to hopefully help you tell better stories, if that makes sense. Because I think sometimes we put too much of that emphasis on this image didn't get that much likes, so it's not a good image, which is really not what it comes down to, because there's so many other variables at play. Instead, you want to focus on what type of individuals, or who are having those reactions to your images, and then talking with those people, not the ones that didn't see it or things like that, because social media and all sorts of other stuff have many positive aspects on our life and on our industry, but also a lot of negatives. So I just wanted to quickly mention that, because we brought up that idea of controlling other people's narrative, and I don't want people to feel like they have to feel that they failed in terms of telling a story if images didn't get 10 likes or things like that. So Just something to think about for sure.
Great point.
Okay, so let's keep going. So for an image that, we talked about the story arcs, we talked about things pulling together. And when you have an image that can kind of pull those pieces together to has a good understanding of composition, which we'll talk about more here soon, lighting, subject matter, atmosphere, and even emotion, then you can use the limitations of a 2D art form to create compelling images, rather than if I took this with a cell phone, or if I took this in a different way, it might not have been as compelling of this church in Vik in Iceland, as I specifically made conscious choices to angle myself where I did, have the perspective that I did, use the shutter speed as I did, process this as I did, were all cognitive choices. And that, again, is a bigger part of the whole idea of a photograph, is the idea of intent, is pulling those pieces together and hopefully having them have some cohesion, rather than just random acts of either luck or happenstance when it comes to in-field choices or post-processing. So where do you start? I think the biggest thing that it comes down to, as I mentioned earlier, is just this change in mindset, this idea that you as a photographer, if you want to really create compelling images, should try to step away from that idea that you're just taking pictures of pretty things, to that idea that I want to either tell a specific story, or at the bare minimum, I want to create images that have an impact, that get a response, that start conversations. Because I think that shift in mindset will help you make some of those initial choices and get you along the right path of where you might ultimately want to be, if you don't feel that your work right now is captivating enough people, is starting enough conversation, is having people to have those reactions to the work that you're creating. So one of the other things that, the initial things that is a big part of this is to photograph things that you're passionate about. So why is that important? For me, as I talked about, I am a huge proponent of landscape, nature, and wildlife, and I have a few different images to share with each of those here. And the reason that I photograph those things is because I love those things, because I am passionate about those different types of genres. This is an image that I took just above $1 Million Road in Telluride in Colorado when I lived out there. And it was this passing storm, this beautiful side light, and it was just an amazing, epic experience with Mount Wilson in the background. And when I was out there photographing this, I had this just giant, stupid smile on my face the entire time because I was so excited to be there, and I wanted to do this scene so much justice, and I cared so much about it. That I knew that anything that I was going to create out there, I was going to be meticulous in my choices. I was going to be, thoughtful in my use of composition and make sure I got the right exposure. And then when I processed it, I wanted to rekindle what it felt like when I was there witnessing this firsthand, so that I can share that experience with others. And that's not something I would do if I was photographing something that I didn't really care about. Going to travel, Alistair, we talked about the idea of traveling. For me, I got into photography not because I have a love of photography. I happened to love travel and became addicted to travel, and then photography was the conduit that I felt was going to, at the time in 2006, when I was 24, that was going to allow me to potentially just keep traveling and having experiences. And so for me, travel photography was a way to capture those experiences and share them with other people around the world that would never have the opportunity to go to these locations or have these experiences. And I can hopefully bring a little bit of these experiences with me to share with other people. And so because of that, again, I pay more attention to the details. And then later in my career, wildlife photography has become my new focus in the last few years, where I do more wildlife projects than anything else. And part of that is because of my love of nature, and I love the challenge that working with a model or a subject, like a wild cheetah, brings with it. And so all these different pieces come together where I want to put forth the energy and the effort into creating the best wildlife images possible because I myself am passionate about it. And, rounding this whole section out really quickly, when I've gone to physical events and met you at Photo Plus and all sorts of other stuff, when I do portfolio reviews and I have an individual come and they show me this portfolio, and it's filled of a really great example, or easy example, is a landscape photographer that loves landscapes but hasn't found a really great way in order to monetize that passion. And so they shoot weddings on the side. And so their heart's not really in wedding photography, but they do it to make a living so that they can get back and do their other stuff. Now, when I look through their portfolios, for the most part, I'd say like 9 times out of 10, I could tell that they are more passionate about their landscape work than they are about their wedding work. And that's because of the attention to detail. That's because of how much heart and soul they put into stuff that human beings typically do when we are doing something that we love. It's not to say that it can't be advantageous for people, obviously, to shoot weddings in that particular situation so that they can do these other things. I'm simply using it as an analogy to say that for the most part, for most of us, if we are photographing things that we truly are passionate about, that we truly do love, then we have a higher tendency to put more effort into it. And generally out of that, you have the ability to create more engaging images because you're willing to go that extra mile in order to get those experiences or to capture those types of scenes.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. It's something we see quite a lot is people with a variety of work in their portfolios. And as you see, you can always tell which one really lights their passion and engages them more. And something that's come up in a lot of conversations here is about, if you want to not shoot weddings and you want to attract all those wildlife or landscape clients, you have to be showing them that work.
Yeah.
Like you're only going to get the clients that you show work that will excite those clients. So yeah, you might be wanting to shoot lots of different genres, but if there's one you really want to specialize in and want to get a customer base for, you have to be brutal and just show that work. Otherwise, you're going to continue to be considered a generalist or attract the clients for the work that you're showcasing that you don't actually love. So it is something we come up against quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the whole idea, the mentality of shoot what you want to actually be doing down the line. And, coming back to, really quickly to my story, when I first got into this, I started off just shooting travel. I was literally traveling the globe as I was single and nomadic and didn't have a home. I was living in Southeast Asia and I was doing nothing but travel. And that's what I became known for. And then all of a sudden I got interested in landscape and I focused on that for a while. And then after, many years of building up, credentials and building up my, portfolio and my names and my companies, I was then in a position to then shoot a wide variety of things. But again, if you look at most photographers in my position that have been doing this for 13 or 14 or 15 years, vast majority of them are known for very specific things. And I've been fortunate to create multiple niches and to have this variety of things that I shoot, but it's required a lot of work and a lot of time investment getting into it. And I didn't do this from the beginning. I had to focus my attention early on, develop myself, build myself up, and then start expanding once I was able to do that and find creative ways in order to wrap that into different revenue streams or to the branding that I was trying to put together.
Can I interrupt you with a question here?
You absolutely can.
Let's see. Gary Monroe asks, how much are you willing to manipulate an image, adding, removing objects to tell the story you want, or do you put personal limits on yourself, such as a photojournalist would do?
I think it depends on the context of what I'm sharing. Now, if I was in Haiti shortly after the 2010 earthquake. I was in Tacloban in 2013, right after the Typhoon Yolanda had hit, and I was out there documenting photojournalistic stuff, which case I have, the same ethics that most journalists have of not manipulating anything. It's a little bit different when I am capturing other things for fine art landscapes or when I'm doing certain types of travel images or things like that. Now, typically for me, my own personal line is that I don't like to add things that weren't there. So if the sky was bad, if I'm not going to add another person in there, things like that. I generally try to draw the line. There's been times where I've experimented a little bit with compositing skies and stuff, but I never really like it because it wasn't what was actually there. Yeah. Where I don't have an issue personally is in terms of removing or cleaning up images, especially when it comes to, macro images of flowers or even, I was just editing a few days ago images I took earlier this year in Uganda with baby silverback gorillas in the jungle. And it's a messy place in the jungle in the wild. And, I'm going to go in and spend time cleaning up their fur and making things look more pristine because that's the story I'm trying to tell. The story I'm trying to tell is not about the dirt and the things that get tied into, these creatures' fur. It's more about these creatures and how special they are, or maybe I'm working on creating these images out of a campaign to raise money for them or whatever the intent is. So for me, I don't have an issue doing that. I'll create a layer in Photoshop and literally I can turn it on and turn it off where you can see all the different small places I've cleaned up. But mostly that's just removing small distracting objects and not completely changing the narrative of what's happening. Yeah. And so for me, that's my line.
Not manipulating the story per se, but just cleaning up, doing a bit of gardening.
Yeah. I mean, that, when it comes to my checklist, when I go through and I'm out there shooting a scene, one of the last steps I do before I take an image is trying to remove distracting objects, whether that's changing my composition or trying to get things or changing the angle or my perspective. And the same thing happens in post-processing where, one of the last steps is to try to go through and say, okay, what story am I trying to tell? What type of emotion am I trying to react? What's the intent of this image to begin with? Mm-hmm. And then what are distracting elements? What are elements within the scene that are pulling away? Is it a small reflection that happens to be on a rock on this at the base of this waterfall? Now, does removing that reflection really change the essence of where I'm at? To me, no. And so I don't mind removing that so that the experience is less diluted or people's attention span is less competitive towards where I'm trying to direct them, which is maybe a specific segment of water flowing over rocks, or maybe the color or the light of what's happening or the atmosphere, things like that.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for answering that.
Yep.
That answers your question, Gary.
All right, so let's continue on. Okay, so studying your environment. This is also another big thing that I think for a lot of people, this is not just for landscape images. This is a photograph that actually Michael Bonacore took of me at Godafoss Waterfall in northern Iceland from a number of years ago. And the reason I like to use this is not only because Iceland's beautiful. It's a country I've been to more times than any other country on earth. I think it's like 35 times now. But because it does a really good job of talking about how much is often going on around the scene of what we tend to photograph and how important it is to occasionally show up to a scene, whether I'm photographing wildlife, whether I'm doing a travel scene, whether I'm photographing an individual or a landscape like this, is I try to spend some time getting to know and studying my scene. In this type of situation, it's like, where is water flowing? How is mist happening? Where is the light changing? instead of just running up to a scene because it's amazing and beautiful and snapping away and having 10,000 versions of a single scene, I want to get to know my subject. I want to get to know and put the time and energy and effort into, assuming I have enough time in terms of light to be able to do so. And when I do that, I generally find that I come away with much more compelling images. So these days, most times when I come across a new scene, a new species, a new experience from a travel photography standpoint, I generally don't have my camera out to start with. I leave it in my backpack. I sit down, I soak in the atmosphere, I soak in the feeling. I try to figure out where naturally my eyes are gravitated towards. And doing that slows down my process and allows me to focus more attention on the details that ultimately matter to me. And again, that I'm passionate about. And then that typically try to use that as my starting point for the story that I'm trying to tell.
That Michael Bonacore guy, he's okay at photography.
He's all right. To be fair, I set up my extra tripod, put my extra camera on there, zoomed in the lens, focused it. All he had to do was press the button. So I don't want to give him too much credit, but he did technically press the button.
Yeah. He says, what does he say? He says, old school, such an incredible trip. This photo was taken at 1 a.m.
Yep.
I guess it was summertime.
Yeah, summertime with the midnight sun. This is one of those places we talked about. I talked about time in this segment a second ago. It's one of the few places on the planet. I mean, you do get it in northern, Canada and Iceland, Norway, Greenland, stuff like that. But where the midnight sun is happening, where the sun begins to set at like 11:45 p.m. and then rises at like 12:45 a.m. And so if you have the right cloud conditions, you can literally have an incredible 360 degree amazing sunset like we have here. And this one lasted for 4 hours. And it's one of those scenes where you shoot a scene for so long that you hate to leave it because the light's so beautiful, but you have literally shot every single angle that you possibly could. And so you have to go try something else. And it kind of spoils you for a lot of other landscape stuff around the world. All right, continuing on. So who or what is our hero? This sounds pretty self-explanatory, but the idea is, is to determine what it is you're trying to photograph. And again, all too often, I think photographers miss this, even though it's kind of a core basic step of photography, is when you see this scene. This was taken on Laguna Amarga in Patagonia. This is a panorama that I shot for a beautiful early sunrise morning over towards Del Pine National Park. And the choices that I made in terms of taking a composition and exposure were one thing, but also the fact that I turned this into a panorama. And the reason that I did that is because of the subject that I was trying to capture. It wasn't just the light that was hitting the mountain. It was the crazy crystal clear reflection that was happening as well. And so I made choices out in the field to change the way I was initially going to shoot this. I originally had a 16-35 on, and it made the mountains way too small. So I had to quickly change to my 24-70, turn it into panorama mode because I realized what was happening, and made those creative choices in order to create an image that was much more engaging, that told more of an interesting story. And so it's a really just important aspect of knowing what story you're trying to tell, and using that as kind of the base point to figure out what is the best way to approach, photography like this, or really any given scene as well. Same thing. Oh, go ahead.
It's real beautiful shot, that last one. Folk are saying it's stunning and beautiful in the comment.
I appreciate it. It was an incredible morning. Absolutely. Okay, so coming back. So this is the Grand Prismatic Geyser in Yellowstone National Park. So this was actually taken from a plane that I had rented in Jackson Hole, and I flew up to Yellowstone and then photographed it. It's about 5,000 feet up in the air, which is the minimum height that you can be when you're flying over a national park. And the reason that I did all that is because I wanted an aerial view to change the perspective, because I found it much more engaging. I made these choices in preparing, in studying and learning about this particular location that I've been to many times before from the ground. And I felt that it was interesting, but not as interesting as all the way up in the air. For most of you probably know that it is illegal to fly drones in national parks in the United States, as well as many countries out there. So my option was to spend a decent amount of money, rent a plane, that had a window that opened up, and then had him circle this geyser for like 40 minutes and getting tons of different shots and angles using polarizers, all sorts of fun stuff, and come away with an image that I was happy with based on that idea that I wanted to change the way I wanted to photograph this, to come away with something that was more unique and more different and more powerful.
So you can fly the ultimate drone there. You just can't fly your own drone.
The ultimate drone. I love my DJI Mavic Pro 2, but nothing. I think I shot this with the, at the time, A7R3. 42 megapixels with a 7-8-200 shooting straight down is going to destroy any quality that you can get from any of those prosumer drones anyway.
Absolutely. And this being 2020, who knows what's going to come out of that geyser this year? It could be an alien spacecraft or
I'm pretty sure it's going to be a Kraken. That's I have that on my COVID 2020 bingo for November.
Release the Kraken. Can you go back to the shot in Chile, if you don't mind? Because Chile asks the question, hey Chile, amazing to find water that still, or was there a bit of long exposure to smooth it out?
So I've been going down to Patagonia for over 9 years now. I actually took my wife down there on our hunt for our honeymoon back when we first got married 10 years ago. And over the course of the many years that I've been going down there, I have had a small number of unique opportunities to be in places like Torres del Paine National Park or Los Glaciers National Park in Argentina, where there was zero wind. Now, for those that don't know, for Patagonia, it is known for its insane winds. I have been down there both personally as well as with workshop clients where we've had over 120 mile an hour winds on a relatively regular basis throughout a week or 2 or 3 of being down there. And that's really difficult to obviously photograph in. You can't get a scene like this. But this particular morning, it was incredibly still, especially closer towards the shoreline. So in order to get this, I got right down towards the shoreline, got it down as far as I possibly could, used the 24-70 to zoom in to remove the shoreline and the water that wasn't reflecting light, used the polarizer to make sure I didn't see through the water, and then was able to get this to capture this image with the almost mirror-like. If you look closely, there is a small amount of blur in the water, but it's hard to tell. And you can see it more when this is images, I think a 200 megapixel panorama. I think I took 6 images or something like that. And if you blow it up to the full 100% of that size, you will see a little bit of that blur. But for most of us observing this, it looks like a mirror, but it isn't. It's more of an optical illusion.
Yeah. I got a personal question. You mentioned this is a panoramic image,
Sure.
A stitched image of multiple exposures. When you're taking a panorama, do you use like a nodal system, a nodal ninja, to get the nodal plane, or do you just swivel the head on the tripod and do it in software?
Yeah, I used to have an RSS, Real Right Stuff, nodal head, and it would find the correct point right in the middle of your lens to alleviate all sorts of the issues you typically get with panoramas. But for this particular image, and a lot of times these days, is that I've especially since I moved to mirrorless a number of years ago, and now I shoot Sony, I always try to think about the weight that I carry to these locations. And so I don't carry one anymore, and usually I just shoot it as is, and then accept the fact that I'm going to lose a few small pixels on the edges, and try to choose very specific lens lengths and use very specific lenses in order to minimize the amount of parallax and other issues that you would typically get with certain types of stuff. So panoramas, I'm sure you'd agree with this, is very similar to other types of photography in the sense or techniques that they're really interesting. People get really fascinated about them, but more often than not, they shoot panoramas in scenes that don't ask for panoramas. They shoot HDR in scenes that don't need high dynamic range just because they can. I think that's a really interesting part about shooting panoramas, is to conditioning your mind and your creativity to try to find the right locations, the right spaces, the right scenes that call for a panorama, rather than just doing it because you can do it. Because oftentimes in those situations, no matter what gear you're using, it's not going to turn out that interesting.
Yeah, the software's got so good at stitching now. I carry a Nodal Ninja, but now that we're mirrorless, the Nodal Ninja is actually one of the heaviest pieces of kit that I carry, like heavier than many of my lenses now. So I think, it's worth the compromise of losing that little bit of quality to to maybe travel a little bit lighter.
Absolutely.
I'll let you catch back up, but before you do, there's another comment here from a dear friend of mine, someone, Elizabeth Gadd, Lizzie Gadd, has posted a comment. And there's a theme going on. She says, "Oh, look, my two favourite bald photographers." Keep being an inspiration, Colby, she says. Thank you, Lizzie, but yeah, go easy on the...
I love Lizzie. Lizzie is one of my favorite photographers out there. You know her work. She's unbelievably talented. She's such a good spirit and a good soul. I love every opportunity I get a chance at Sony events that we do together, because she's also a Sony ambassador, as well as the expos and stuff like that. She's just good people. And as you know, in the photo industry and the crazy times that we have, like, we need more good people in our lives and in our industry. So she's one of the best. So for those that are listening that haven't heard about her, follow Lizzie, because her work is phenomenal.
Not just an incredible photographer, just an amazing human being. And if you're not familiar with Lizzie's work, here on this YouTube channel, the SmugMug Films YouTube channel that you're watching, you can actually go watch the SmugMug film that we made with Lizzie. Gosh, I can't even, was it 2 years ago now, Lizzie? We made an incredible insight into the work that Lizzie does here in Scotland, in the Isle of Skye. It's absolutely phenomenal. So once you're finished watching this, go check out Lizzie's film here on this channel. Incredible. Good to see you in the chat there, Lizzie.
Absolutely. My seal of approval for sure. Okay, so and then, really quickly wrapping up the segment, talking about, your hero, the subject of your image, and having that scene that play a big role in the image you're trying to create. This is a picture of the head of a very remote tribe in Papua New Guinea that I photographed a year and a half ago. And this is one of those scenes where I wanted to use, I was using, I think, my 85 G Master lens, great portrait lens, really, compresses the background, beautiful, background blur and bokeh. And the choices that I wanted to, when I saw this individual, to create an image like this, caused me to choose certain types of lenses and then choose certain types of exposures. And then I made sure to position myself in a way that emphasized the focus on the subject. And I think that's, again, a really big key. It wasn't just that it was this individual and I could take this, a portrait of this guy 1,000 different ways. It was his eyes and the reflection and the contrast of the face, the paint on his face and his skin color and all of these pieces coming together that caused me to make these creative choices, because I identified very specifically what it was about this individual that I wanted to capture. The same way that it was the, very specific, aerial view that I was going for a change in perspective, causing me to photograph it in a certain way, because I felt that the subject of the colors and the contrast and everything was calling so much for it. And again, for the panorama, the reason that I chose a panorama is because the subject and the choice of the hero of this image really called for it. So again, cognitive choices of really diving down a bit deeper than just, this is a pretty scene, I want to photograph this person. It's like, what is it about that person? What is it about this scene? Is it color? Is it light? Is it reflection? Is it motion? Like, what is your actual subject? Because it can be anything. And I think that's really important to think about, because that choice should be the origin point for all your other creative choices you make out there in the field. And sometimes I feel that people overlook that, and they don't think about that as pragmatically as they should, because it is such an important part of any time you you expel the energy in order to lift up your camera and take a picture. It should be for a purpose or for that intent, in my personal opinion. So moving forward, okay, so frame your story. I'll try to go these a little bit faster, because I know we don't want to sit on here for 2 or 3 hours. So frame your story. This is essentially the idea that from a story-like standpoint, or our analogy of storytelling, framing your story is that part of setting your scene. It's the choices that you make from a compositional standpoint that allow you to direct the viewer, that allow you to put an emphasis on things. I mean, this scene, this image right here, is very similar to what we were talking about, Alistair, just before we started, when we were trying to figure out where we were going to position myself when I was doing this presentation. And we said, should we go on the left? Should we go on the right? And because of how I'm looking at the different images, we decided that where, my main screen here is where I'm looking at my presentation, even though the camera's over here, because it allowed me to look across the frame. The same thing that I try to work in most of my portraits is where this is an image, an inlay lake in Myanmar of a fisherman. And I specifically wanted him positioned a certain way. And I wanted to make sure that I was framing it in a way that he was looking across the emptiness of the left side of the frame of this image. And so the cognitive choice of composing an image and using natural framing, such as the darkened background, in order to frame this subject really allows me to put that emphasis on the choice that I have of that origin point. Again, the hero or subject of our story. And again, framing could be in ways that is not just about what you include, but what you exclude. A lot of people don't think about composition that way. They're always like, oh, well, what do I want to have in here? Or I'm going to shoot landscape and just use my widest angle lens because I want to get everything in there. That's not really, that rarely really works out in my personal opinion, and unless you're doing astro work and you're trying to get like a billion different stars. So for me, this is a photograph taken in Antelope Canyon in Arizona. And this is in southern Antelope. And this particular scene is a very beautiful spot because you obviously get these like onion-like layers happening in this scene. And the reason I took this photograph is I looked up and I saw it, but there was so much of the sky that was actually showing and that you can't see here in frame, because once I looked up and saw it, I backed my tripod up, lowered it to the ground, tried to get it further against the wall. And for those listening, this is before they banned tripods, which are unfortunately now banned in there. This was taken like 3 years ago. And then, continued to maneuver myself, use the rear flip out screen to figure out what was the right framing that would remove any of that high contrast, bright blue sky and the really brightness of it, and really just focus on the layers. And so again, it was a cognitive choice because the layers and the light and the contrast was the hero of the subject. And so I wanted to find a composition that emphasized that. And so I wanted to frame this in a way that was, again, unique and different. And interestingly enough, this is an image I actually licensed with Google back in the day. And it's one of my most viewed images, I think, because it's one of the ones that will pop up if you have a Google Chromecast. Last I checked, it was at like 180 billion views or something like that. It's rather insane.
1 or 2.
Yeah, one or two views. And I think part of that is, again, because it's interesting, because it's unique, and because it creates this feeling of depth within this two-dimensional image because of the use of composition as a main key element in identifying that subject. Okay, let's keep going on. So simplifying your images. Again, this kind of further talks about that idea that I just alluded to. Landscape photographers constantly reaching for their 16 to 35 because they want to get everything in the frame rather than, focusing on a very individual subject. Now, this, of course, is a wildlife image. This was a caiman taken in Brazil. But the idea is still the same. I could have photographed this caiman a million different ways. I could have chose the composition that was high up. I could have, used a different aperture. I could have changed my perspective. But I wanted to remove all those distracting elements. I didn't want much of the reeds in the background. Didn't want any of the other caimans in there. I wanted to remove all those distracting elements. And so I focused and zoomed in on this very particular caiman, lowered my camera really, really close to the water. It's a shallow pool that this little guy was in. Use my rear LCD screen to flip it up and kind of had, if I can move my hand up, I was like holding the barrel of the lens here, holding the back of the camera here, like literally centimeters off the top of the water, so that I can get that kind of straight shot and simplify and remove all those other distracting elements. Because again, I wanted to direct the viewer to photograph or to focus on what I wanted them to see. And the same thing happens. Go ahead.
How did you get so level with the water? Are you in a boat, or is it at the edge of the pool? Or
this particular one was at an edge of a pool. For those that don't know, caimans are quite small. It's not like the big salties that you get in Australia, the crocs that are the size of vehicles. These guys typically get maybe 3 meters at max, 2-3 meters. But this particular one was a young adolescent, so I think he was maybe 2 years old, something like that. It was shallow enough water where I could see most of the stuff that was around, so I wasn't worried about anything snapping up or biting me. And I literally I was standing on the edge of the pool and then just like lowered the camera down and got the shots that I wanted. I saw the creature, I saw the caiman, and then literally was like, okay, I want to try this. And then it was like a step-by-step process of building up the the confidence that something wasn't going to happen, or taking my time studying the scene and then making sure I could pull it off safely, and obviously was able to come away with something I was very happy with.
The detail in that shot is phenomenal. Absolutely,
it's a good one. Yeah, I'm very. It's one of my favorite ones of Caymans that I've ever taken.
What length of lens would you have been using there?
This particular one was shot with a 100 to 400, so I believe I was at the 400 range.
Maxed out.
Yeah, maxed out, which really I needed not only for distance, but also to add to the compression and to make up for the 5.6 max minimum aperture for that particular lens.
Yeah, incredible.
Same thing happened, that I do in landscape sometimes. So ice caves, people go to Iceland and places, Alaska, Greenland to go photograph ice caves. Again, a lot of times, myself included, reach for big wide angle lenses, and that can tell an interesting story, but sometimes isolating out and, again, simplifying those compositions can really go a long way in terms of creating something that's captivating and that is unique and different. This particular, drip of ice did that for me, and I changed out of my 16 to 35 lens, swiveled over my 7200, found the right composition, and then just made sure to capture the reflected light as best I can. And then in post-processing was able to darken a little bit more of the background to kind of give the look and feel that I wanted. But again, the same idea was simplifying your composition. It's probably the most, I probably give this particular advice to more workshop clients than not around the world, whether it's landscape travel or wildlife, based workshops, is that idea that you should simplify your compositions. Figure out the story you want to tell, try to remove everything else that you possibly can, isolate down and tell a more intimate story than trying to tell every story. And to me, that's helped with a lot of my images, where I try to look for the intimate moments and create something captivating there, rather than get inundated or obsessed with the sheer grandeur of a beautiful mountain-like scene in the Himalayas, or of a big ice cave in Iceland, or a set of limans, roaming the Sahara in Africa. I want to generally try to isolate down and focus on these individual smaller stories, because I have more control over, again, potentially captivating an audience than if I brought too much into the fray. So help direct the viewer. This is, again, small talks of composition, the idea that you can have compositional elements that kind of bring the viewer and help. It's not just that you're choosing to position the subject someplace or use, framing like we talked about in the section before, but literally have elements that allow the viewer to kind of focus where you want them to. So again, this is back in Inle Lake in Myanmar. This individual actually happened to have a very large fishing net. So these guys used to be out there fishing, and there still is a lot of fishing on Inle Lake, but some of these guys, because of how tourism has opened up since Myanmar has come to open itself up in 2013 to more democratic government and allowing tourists into the country for the first time in a long time, that these individuals have actually gone more into the tourist side of things. So they will work with other tour captains, or just go out and sail on the waters, and will pose or allow you to create and use them almost like models out there in the lakes, and it allows them to make a little extra money, or make more money than they could before, and allows us to get interesting images that we wouldn't really be able to get otherwise. And so for this particular scene, this guy had a really, really big fishing net with a very large opening for the hole on the backside, which you typically don't get. And so I was able to fit a 12 to 24 in there, shoot at 12, and really just kind of find the right balance and balance it with the buoyancy of the boat, and get something that was unique, that, again, everything in the scene just directs you exactly where I want you to, right at the fisherman himself.
Yeah, a lot of people loving the framing and composition of that one in the chat.
It's a fun one. It's again one of those hard things. We could have a whole conversation talking about the ethics of travel photography, and how things are changing because of tourism. At the end of the day, I often think those arguments are generally very one-sided, from more privileged Western people complaining that people in developing countries are trying to find new ways to make money and to make a living. For me, I'm always trying to support local communities and people like this, and it allows them to feed their families and to do all sorts of amazing stuff, and to create images like this that you're not going to get by walking up to a random fisherman on, Inle Lake or in some place and be like, hey, can I stick my camera inside your lens and get this shot? Like, it's just not going to happen. So yeah, I love this composition, but I also it's a good example just to talk about the support for local communities as well.
Indeed.
For a lot of travel photography. So, composition wise, again, leading lines, the idea that you have elements within your frame or choose specific compositions, shooting horizontal or vertical, in order to lead the viewer into places you want them to see. This is something I constantly try to think about. So image on the left is Kirkjufellsfoss in West Iceland, and using the flowing water and the stream at sunrise specifically to draw the viewer throughout the entire frame as they follow along the stream. And the same thing, this is actually in Norway, taken in the summertime in the Senja part north of Lofoten Islands in northern Norway above the Arctic Circle, and just waiting for the right wave that allowed, again, the viewer and the reflected light coming off of the waves crashing on the rocks in the image on the right to kind of, again, direct the viewer out, and kind of almost creates a curve like, S forming throughout the scene, again, giving more opportunities for the viewer to pay more attention to the details and so also being more invested in what you're trying to show them, because they're taking more time in order to look at all the details because you've given them these pathways. So use light and color to control atmosphere and emotion. This is simply the idea that your choice of exposure is limitless when it comes to creating unique images. And I think that most of the time when we're learning photography, we learn about the histogram, right? And we're not shooting in manual mode. We're shooting in either auto mode, or we're shooting in one of the priority modes. We're trying to get a grasp of how ISO, shutter speed, and aperture work. But the reality is that even though we're taught that our histograms are supposed to look perfectly even and have this nice balanced little mountain in the middle with nice midtones and not too much shadows and not too much highlights, the reality is that if I actually looked at my portfolio for the images that I've licensed the most of, images that I've used in more projects around the world, the images that that are the most popular, the histograms on nearly all of them are either skewed to the left or skewed to the right. And a lot of those choices were made intentionally with the idea that I wanted to use light in order to control atmosphere and emotion. It's not just about having a balanced, perfect exposure. It's about having the right exposure for the right subject. And so, again, coming back to Myanmar, this candlelight scene in front of this Buddha statue with this young monk, if you look at the histogram for it, it's like heavily over to the left. It is everything wrong that you're read in books about how to learn about photography. But it was the right call for the image because I was trying to capture the ambient light and very specific spectrums of light rather than having something that's balanced. I couldn't have captured this image if I was shooting in auto mode. I was shooting in manual mode and specifically choosing both composition and exposure elements in order to control that light because I felt that it was much more moody and therefore would invoke much more of an emotional reaction. Same thing with the Northern Lights. Whenever you're shooting stuff with Astro, it's the use and control of your exposure in order to figure out how much Northern Lights or how many stars you're going to capture. It becomes even more challenging when you include foreground elements like these cabins in Lofoten Islands in Norway, taken in winter, where you have to try to balance the different types of contrasting light that you have in a given scene in order to come away with something that was unique. I think this shutter speed ended up being like 14 seconds or something like that. And that gave me a healthy balance between the amount of light that I wanted to get in the background and the light in the foreground without having things blown out too much with the lights that were lighting up these cabins. And, in theory, a lot of photographers will take multiple different images and exposures of the scene. And you can do that. There's nothing necessarily wrong. But sometimes I want to capture all of it into a single raw file and then play with that rather than try to get all sorts of different types of exposures and, again, pull those pieces in. I don't necessarily have an ethical issue with that. I just try to avoid that if I can and still come away with something that's creative and different and unique. And then this is a Patagonia. This is one of my favorite images of Patagonia that is kind of interesting because it's not the popular view of Torres del Paine National Park with the famous horns that most people share images of in the region. But the reason I love it so much is because of the choice of exposure. And this image specifically I used here because it was more so with a focus on the processing side of things, where this image was quite a bit more flat when I took it and began to process it. But as I began to process it from the post-processing side of things to kind of complete that story from my side of those first three elements, is
Lost you a little bit there, Colby. Yeah, it looks like we've lost your connection. Can you still hear us? No, looks like Colby may have disappeared for a moment. Yep, looks like we've lost internet connection to Colby. Used up all your bandwidth.
Capturing motion.
Hear us? Oh, we lost most of you.
Yeah, I'm still here.
We lost you for a little bit there. You broke up, and I think Skype
oh no,
bugged out on us. So, but
that
you
was
can keep
weird.
going. We got you back. Okay, we'll keep going. It's maybe the internet telling us we're talking for too long.
You're doing too much. All right. Well, this is the last few ones. So, creatively capturing motion. This is the idea of using motion to control tension or a little bit of emotion at the same time. And it's the choice of using a very fast shutter speed, but not using too fast a shutter speed to kind of isolate the wings of this hummingbird that I took on my backpack here in Pennsylvania, but to give it a little bit of emotion, because the motion of the wings obviously showcase just how fast this hummingbird is flapping its wings, and it gives that sense of a slight bit of tension, which is different than when you freeze, things in time, because it gives a very different feeling to it. And the same thing can be said for landscape. When you are slowing shutter speeds down, oftentimes I'm really trying to pay really close attention to the shutter speeds that I'm using to capture motion, because I want to, again, convey certain types of feelings. Sometimes I want to capture more of the tension of water rather than freezing it in time. So I'll use something like a 0.5 or 0.6 seconds for a shutter speed. And oftentimes like this, where I want to showcase more of that flow and dreamlike feel, I'm going for like anywhere between 1 to 4 or 5 seconds, because it gives, again, a very different feel for that choice of capturing motion. And instead of having tension in the image like we had before with the showcasing the motion of the hummingbird, we have more of a dreamlike look or feel. So again, your choice of shutter speed plays a role in how that idea of tension or motion can play a role in the images you're choosing, not just because it looks nice, but because it's conveying something very specifically. So use of perspective and scale, again, the idea of having individuals be in scenes. Now this is actually one that Bonacore did take. That's actually me in Torres del Paine National Park. And we kind of set this shot up specifically with this image in mind, with me walking in this particular part with the sun hitting me, wearing this nice red jacket standing out against the whiteness of the snow. But it gives you a sense of scale of just how amazingly large these mountains are, which you would not have if you didn't have that sense of scale or perspective. And the same thing I typically do in a handful of my other images. This was a selfie that I took, or I had set up in Uluru in Western Australia, or sorry, the Red Center of Australia in the Northern Territories on the left, where I set up the camera and then ran down there and was able to get the shot at sunrise. And again, added just a bit of perspective for what people can expect in terms of size, and it also allows to have a human element that people can feel almost like they are there. On the right, this is a waterfall in Iceland. Same type of situation, but that wasn't myself. It was actually another photographer that we had met just at another place around the corner and told him he can come. And I ended up hiking around the waterfall. I was taking these images, and then I realized that he was in the shot. And I distinctly remember like yelling out, and he couldn't, of course, hear me because you have this thundering of the waterfalls coming down. And I was like, "Get out of the shot! Get out of the shot!" And I was like, "Wait, don't move! Don't move!" And it really, again, brought, I think without him there, it's a nice image, but you, again, don't get the scope of just how big everything is and the scale that it presents itself, even if I didn't intentionally mean for it to happen in the first place. Details matter. So this is essentially just the idea that, it builds upon that idea that you're photographing things you're passionate about. But for me, it's a very distinct message or tip for people out there, is that every image that you take, you should take with the mindset that you're ultimately going to blow it up to something that is 2 feet by 3 feet or quite large is the point. And the reason that I have that mentality is because I pay so much more attention to those details. If we think of this image of this gecko, this is a gold dust gecko taken in Hawaii, that if there were small, specks of dust or things happening on the leaf behind it, if you're looking at it on the back of your camera, you're like, that's not that big of a deal. It's part of the scene. I should probably leave it in there. And then you get home and you throw it on your laptop, it's just like 15 inches. And you're like, okay, it's a little bit bigger, but it's still not that big a deal. All of a sudden it's on your 32-inch monitor. All of a sudden a company licenses it and it's, on a billboard somewhere. And that small speck that you didn't think was a distracting element is now, 2 feet by 3 feet in size because, you license this image to a billboard in Times Square. And so I just try to take the mentality that anything that I create, even if it doesn't end up going on a physical print somewhere large, is that I want to have that mentality that if anything does get blown up that big, how good are my details? How meticulous am I about distracting elements? How good of job have I done on sharpening and controlling noise? Like all the little details that go into the image, I have this mindset that I want to perfect it as best I can so that those elements don't become distracting, assuming the image then becomes or gets put on a medium that is much, much larger than the 3 inches on the back of our screen. And the last little bit is simply that there are no rules. This is the mentality that, I've given you some ideas, some tips and tricks, some tools to hopefully give you some idea about the different types of photography that you shoot and how you can take your images to the next level, but none of them are rules. And I like using this particular image in this segment of this talk because if you think about it, what's the quote unquote rule that we're all taught when it comes to composing our images? It's the rule of thirds, right?
In the center.
Exactly. Don't put your horizon in the center. Know the rule of thirds. Always place them in those only points. Like I cannot stand that it is called a rule because it's not a rule. There are no rules. There can be elements of guidelines like that can help in certain situations and make certain types of images more pleasing. But there can also be just as many benefits to breaking the rules and creating something that's unique and different because it stands out from everyone else that are following these rules. I don't have it here. I should put it into this presentation, but I have this image that I took when I was living in Boulder, Colorado, and I remember we had this crazy snowstorm that had shown up in it's like February or something, one of the years I was living there. I remember jumping in my car and trying to head out to the Flatirons right out there, just outside of Boulder, to take some images of the snow falling on the mountains. And it was like a blizzard. Like I had no visibility. I couldn't see anything that was happening there. I remember getting on the highway and being like, I can't see anything. What am I doing? I should turn around. And I go to exit and I look over to my right and I see this tree that is just kind of isolated on this small hill. So you have the snowy like clouds behind it, which are all white. You have all this snow coming down and it's covered in snow, but it's dead tree because it's in wintertime. And so all you have is like the sticks of the tree, the branches, but there's nothing else on it. And I thought to myself, I was like, you know what, this would be really interesting to use as an example to create something that was unique and different. So I went to frame it. I shot it outside the window of my car because I didn't want to get out because, cars are sliding around. I didn't want to get killed. But I rolled down my window. I threw on my 70-200. I zoomed in to 200. I chose a composition where it's at the very bottom of the frame. So instead of at the third, instead of in the middle, instead of wherever it's supposed to be for symmetry, it's at the very bottom. And the rest of it is completely blown out because I chose a shutter speed that allowed enough of the brightness to essentially allow it to be high key, where only detail that you see is this lone, isolated, dead tree in the middle that had these kind of perfect, nice branches. And it was just a really great lesson to me personally to be, to sit there and say my exposure and my histogram are completely blown. I put this in the place where I've been told I never should do. And it was my favorite image that I took, that winter. And it just goes to show that you don't need to listen to rules. You can break the rules. You can use things as guidelines to get your feet comfortable with what you're trying to create, but never feel that you have to confine yourself to a box with what you're trying to create. Because if you do, you'll be creating the same things everyone else does. And sometimes it can be nice to really break those molds and to experiment and to challenge yourself to come away with something that's much more unique and different and that is you rather than, what you're supposed to be capturing in a given scene. So that's my wrap-up tip for everyone that is listening.
That's awesome. I'll let you stop sharing your screen.
Sure.
We spoke about how doing something you're passionate about shows in your work. But I think it shows that you've been talking for an hour and 30 minutes, and it feels like we've been chatting for 5 minutes. You and I could go for another 2 hours talking about this stuff. It's
For sure.
because we love it so much. Your images are stunning, dude. There's just no denying it. I've loved your work for so long. So the fact you probably did that as a condensed presentation, but yeah, it went awesome. It's really long. Can we do a couple of quick fire questions?
Absolutely. No, I'd love it.
One other thing I want to mention, but we'll do a couple of quick fire questions. Gary Monroe asks, how much are you willing to crop an image, if at all?
It's a good question. I think it depends, again, on the intent of the image and the limitations that you have with the gear that you have. Certainly in my wildlife with certain types of scenes, I have been willing to crop in as much as I possibly could, knowing that ultimately I, am limiting the potential medians in which those images can potentially be housed, large prints, big image licensing, things like that. But more times than not, I try to capture as many megapixels as possible without cropping as I possibly can. And then we'll try to make those decisions in post. And to use that as a general guideline. If I'm photographing a bear in Alaska, I want to fill as much of that frame as I possibly can with my subject, knowing that if I need to crop in, I can. But if I don't have the right lens, I'm going to get the best that I possibly can, and then I'll just have to deal with the rest of it because I really don't have any other choices anyway. But it is also good to know, Gary, and for anyone else listening, that technology has improved so much when it comes to post-processing, but specifically when it comes to upsizing and creating larger versions of your images using AI technology, both from Adobe's and Sense AI, as well as things like Topaz's Gigapixel AI, where you can still print off very large versions of images with much less trade-off than you could before. So don't be afraid to crop in if it calls for it, and know that there is some technology that can help you bring some of that resolution back. It's not the same as if you originally shot it as a raw file, but it can be pretty dang close, and technology's only going to get better from here.
Absolutely. You'd be amazed at how the print houses can print big now and rip a file and print it at resolutions we normally wouldn't have even considered. It's incredible what they can do. This next question is going to look like such a planted, loaded question, but it's there, so I'm going to ask it. Kaylee asks, do you prefer Sony over other brands? No, he hates Sony. And if so, what do you find the pros are over Sony to the other brands?
Well, I mean, I'll try to give a condensed answer.
That's a whole other hour.
We could just talk about camera gear. Obviously for me, I'm a Sony ambassador. I've shot with Sony now for 5 years. Before that, I shot Canon for 7 years. Then I had 1 year where I actually shot both Canon and Nikon. So I essentially spent like $25,000 and duplicated my gear back when Nikon had the D800E first came out and the D3, I think. And then I had the 1DX2 and then the 5D Mark 3 or 4. Anyway, I've gone through the gamut. And for me personally, I feel that Sony is leading the charge in terms of innovation and what they've been doing with sensor technology and understanding of autofocus. That being said, to be 100% honest, any camera that's been manufactured in the last 3 or 4 years is capable of taking amazing images. Heck, even if you put it in the right hands, cameras taken from 10 years ago. I still sell prints taken from a Kodak 6490 that was a 4.1 megapixel bridge camera that was my first digital camera from 13 years ago. I think skill and technique and creative vision plays more of a role. That being said, the different camera manufacturers are creating different types of bodies and lenses that, while at their core are very similar in what they're potentially able to do, but there's a lot of the little small stuff that I think make or break or decide what's best camera for an individual or for an artist or a creative. For me personally, when it comes to Sony, their use of dynamic range and sensor technology that they make most of the sensors that are out there in the world to the date. I think it's like 70% of all sensors between smartphones and cameras around the world are all made from Sony. So they have that kind of leg up. But they're also constantly, every time they come out with new generations of images or new generations of cameras and sensors, they're constantly answering questions that I didn't feel I needed to ask. And I think that to me is what personally separates them from a lot of the other manufacturers out there, where they're they're innovating in really unique ways to questions that I didn't know I should have asked, and having features that I didn't know I wanted until I had them. And so that's why I shoot Sony. I think Sony's doing a great job with the technology they're putting out there. I think they're doing a great job building up a community. They have Sony Alpha Female, which is something that none of the other manufacturers are doing out there to support female creators. They have a much more diverse, community ambassador base these days, trying to reach out and represent a larger, more diverse community. There's a lot of stuff that they're doing that are great. And this isn't to say that Fuji or Nikon or Canon are bad. It's just that personally, I feel that Sony is leading the charge, and that's why I shoot them. That's why I am an ambassador for them. And that's why I ditched all my other camera gear when I ended up making this move 5 years ago.
Yeah, that's great. Kaylee says she's got another hour. Let's keep talking. But the cameras today are phenomenal. Sony's doing great things, but I want you all to remember that ultimately they're boxes with a hole in them and a sensor at the back, and you can make great images on all cameras, no matter what brand or make they are. Yes, there's advantages to having the latest greatest thing, but don't feel you need that to tell the stories the way Colby's been telling you to tell stories. You can tell stories with an iPhone, with one of the early digital cameras or a film camera. It's literally a box with a hole in it. So don't get bogged down with needing the latest greatest. I'm going to ask one other quick one.
Sure.
I'm going to ask you to answer it quickly too. I think you may know Josh Minka. He says, Colby, are you ever tempted to go medium format?
I haven't, because the benefits of medium format is obviously the sensor is just so much bigger. And so you have the ability potentially in certain situations to be able to capture more dynamic range and have more detail, which you can get the photons based on the size of the sensor and all sorts of other, fun technical terms. For me, the trade-offs currently, even with the new, Fuji series, which are popular, even though their top end line is still $10,000 for medium format camera, is that the trade-offs that I personally would have to deal with in terms of the size and weight and expense of the lenses and the body and the portability do not equal the trade-off that we're currently getting with full frame cameras from multiple manufacturers. I mean, my main go-to camera right now is the Sony A7R Mark IV, which is 62 megapixels. Canon just released their EOS 5R, which is 45 megapixels. The what's happening with full frame sensors and increasing resolution and still maintaining control over ISO and dynamic range are inching closer and closer and closer to an acceptable trade-off to the benefits that you would typically get from medium format without the costs associated or without the size of the camera gear and the weight that you have to lug around. So I think there's still definitely a place for medium format, and I'm glad that there is, because there's some amazing stuff being done with it. But for someone like myself that goes to remote places, that travels to crazy destinations, that photographs wildlife, that needs an assortment of things such as high ISO performance, autofocus capabilities, and dynamic range, medium format doesn't check those boxes for me. And for me, I'm gonna stick with what I have with current technology. If things change 5 years from now, sure, I'm open to seeing what tools make it easy. Yeah, exactly. And I just to piggyback off of your point that you made at the end of the last segment and feeding into this, I think that creativity and your ability to tell stories and your understanding of your camera and the different tips and techniques will always do more for you than buying a new camera, or a new sensor or new lenses. And that being said, though that is the most important, the tools themselves, in my personal opinion, the only time to really look to upgrade what you're using is when you feel the tools are limiting your creativity and you can't actually capture the things you want to capture in your mind, but you've mastered what you've had. And I think that's a big, whether it's medium format, whether you want to switch to Sony, whether you want to try Canon, whatever it is, all the manufacturers are going to leapfrog each other. And if you perfect and spend your time and energy and effort and money, if it's investment, to learn more about what you have, the limitations that it has and that you have. And once you're ready, if you feel that ceiling of what you can create is here, but you want to be up here, then think about upgrading your stuff, spending
Yeah.
and investing money in new lenses or new sensors, or jumping ship to a new camera manufacturer. There's lots of opportunities out there, but don't do it expecting it to solve your issues. You're going to have the same issues you have with other cameras if you still haven't fully understand the fundamentals of your exposure, of your camera, of menu systems, of techniques in the field.
Yeah.
Those are always going to go much further for you.
Yeah, yeah. I say it's only a box with a hole in it, but and fieldcraft is everything and skill. But hey, I like collecting all the gear and all the latest. You know, we're all as guilty of it as each other. Right. To finish up, thank you for all the questions. I really appreciate it. But to finish up, before we make this the longest episode we've ever done, the I've posted in the show description a link to the Giving Lens. And I wanted an opportunity to talk about that, and maybe you can briefly explain a little bit of the background to the Giving Lens and what you do there, and what the future holds for the Giving Lens.
Absolutely. So for those that don't know, the Giving Lens is an organization that I started in 2011, which essentially is the idea of blending the idea of photography and passion for photography and the arts with support for sustainable development initiatives, NGOs, charities around the world, where we take teams of photographers that we're training, so people that are learning photography, and we bring them into situations that are unique and different, where we get behind closed door access to communities that are fighting very specific challenges around the world. This could be youth education projects, women's vocational schools, species preservation organizations, clean drinking water projects. We work with refugees coming up from Central America coming into the U.S. We've worked with Syrian refugees going into Jordan, all sorts of different things. And each trip essentially that we do, which typically outside of 2020 acts as a fundraiser where we're raising money for these organizations, for the communities that you end up finding yourself working with, where you get someone like myself or some of my staff. I'm not personally on every trip, but some of my staff that are there to help teach you how to be better photographers. And then you yourself are either documenting a project or learning in a collaborative learning environment where we're teaching you, and then you are teaching maybe a youth education program in Nicaragua, or teaching an organization how to document their own projects so they can create advocacy content to raise money for their causes. And so it's a really great opportunity to allow you to tangibly give back to communities, taking all of the stress and the confusion about which organizations are good out there. Where do you spend your money? How does your money go a long way, to try to make that simple for you, and to give you a variety of different options depending on where which topics pull your heartstrings. Maybe kids, specific work with kids is something that's important to you because that's something that means something to you, or specific things with wildlife, or clean drinking water you think is one of the most important things happening, in the world these days, and finding and preserving clean drinking water. We have different opportunities for you in different countries around the world to learn in these unique environments. And it's been pretty awesome seeing it grow and evolve over the years. 2020, because of obviously everything happening, we are taking a hiatus. We ran a few trips at the early of the year, and just like my own main company, we are on pause until 2021, and things start to get a little bit more open. We're still working on some ideas to do some socially distanced, more local stuff nationally here in U.S. and Canada. We don't have anything to announce just yet, but we will hopefully be back at it in 2021, 2022, providing these spaces for people like yourself to give back and to make a difference, and to allow your money to go to the right places to help people that actually need it, fighting for causes that you're passionate about it. And that's our goal, is to be that middleman, to provide that experience for you, so that you have a pathway to do more good with your passion for photography, and whether it's through us or other organizations that do different types of things tangentially towards what we do, like Photographers Without Borders and stuff like that. We just want to continue to provide more opportunities for photographers and artists and creatives and video makers to make a difference in the world. And that's what we hope to do.
Yeah, it's awesome. The work you do with the Giving Lens is phenomenal. Our dear friend who we've mentioned a few times today, Michael Bonacore, introduced me to the Giving Lens. I know he does trips with you and is one of the leaders there at the Giving Lens, and he introduced me to what you do there, well, I guess a decade ago now, and it's phenomenal. So all the strength to you with the Giving Lens. I hope it goes from strength to strength. If you're watching and you want to find out more about the Giving Lens, there's a link in the description below. I believe it's just thegivinglens.com. Would that be right?
That's correct. Yep.
Go check out the work that Colby and the team does there. It's a very, very worthwhile organisation. Colby, I'll be back in a few seconds just to say thank you to you. But for those of you that are watching, thank you so much for joining. Hit that subscribe button. Hit the bell notification. Oh, my camera's gone all funny today. That's interesting. There we go. Yeah, sorry about that. Everything's getting tired. So yeah, hit that bell notification. Hit that way you'll be notified of every episode that we release here on SmugMug Live. Tomorrow, as I mentioned, we've got isnt Chang joining us to talk about his automotive and lifestyle photography. That's going to be a real fun episode tomorrow. That will be at noon Pacific time. So thank you for hopefully joining us tomorrow. But for now, Colby, thank you so much for today. I really, really appreciate all the time you've given us. I think we may have made the record of the longest episode, and we've only just started, right? We could talk about this all day, and I think people want us to keep talking, but unfortunately we have other commitments today, including family, that we have to go attend to. So, Colby, thank you so much. If you've enjoyed this episode, give it a thumbs up, give it a like, subscribe to the channel. It really helps support what we do here. Thank you for listening. Colby, look after yourself. Hopefully we get to travel again together soon and catch up somewhere in the world. But thank you so much for all your time today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me. This was awesome. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing more of the artists you have on here. I also like to learn and find inspiration from everyone else out there as well.
Absolutely.
So thank you. And thank you guys for watching. You guys were awesome.
Yeah, lots of past episodes. This is episode 41, so there's a lot to go back, catch up if you haven't seen them, folks. And also check out the SmugMug Films playlist here on SmugMug Films channel. You get some real amazing films, inspiring and motivating you about some of the best photographers in the world. But wherever you are in the world, have a great day, and we'll see you back here tomorrow with isnt Chang. But for now, thank you, stay safe, be good to each other, and take care. Bye. Bye.